don't you make them look like a person of low integrity because you're claiming a lot more than their case is worth. That's on you, but it hurts the plaintiff. So on the burden of proof, you have to negate the influence of the personality of the plaintiff. But remember, when we come to this whole thing about personalities, there are two personalities in the case or more. The defendant also has a personality, the defendant truck driver. So you want to attack or enlighten the jury with respect to the aspects of the truck driver's personality. You want to prove that through his personality, he is exactly the kind of person who would speed up to try to make that light. He's exactly the kind of person who would choose to drive 70 miles an hour in a 55-mile zone. He's exactly the kind of person who would be irresponsible. So when it comes to personality and circumstance, it's not a one-way street. It's not personality of the plaintiff versus circumstances of the defendant. It's personality of the plaintiff versus personality of the defendant. And then it's the circumstances. And remember, here's the best part of circumstances. Almost always, the defendant creates the circumstances that the plaintiff finds himself in that leads to the injury. So the circumstance, if the circumstance is critically important, but they go back to the original proposition, fundamental attribution error. They're putting it in the background. They're putting circumstance, the bad actions and the circumstances that were created by the conduct of the defendant, all things being equal, the fundamental attribution error says in establishing causation, the jurors will put that circumstance, that bad conduct of the defendant, in the background and put personality in the foreground. That's why this is such an extremely important topic. It applies to every type of case. Personality versus circumstances. So you want to focus on the influence of the personality of the defendant. Is this the kind of person who would drive at this rate of speed? Is this the kind of person who would follow such reckless conduct? Is this the kind of person who makes bad, and one of the most important words in litigation, who makes bad choices? Choices. It's all about choices. So you stress the influence of the circumstances as they bear on the actions. And remember, stress who created those circumstances. That's what it's all about. Put in a lot of evidence, a lot of conversation, a lot of cross-examination about precisely what the defendant did that created those circumstances. And compare it. Remember, everything is compared to what? We're always comparing things. We talk about this, but compare to what would have occurred if the defendant had acted properly. What would have occurred if the defendant had done what a reasonably prudent driver would do under the same or similar circumstances and slowed his truck and applied his brakes and stopped before he got to the red light instead of running it. So that's your comparison to what? But it's by bringing, the whole objective is to bring circumstances into the foreground. Bring the defendant's personality into the foreground. Put the plaintiff's personality as being an attribute of the plaintiff. Overcome the bad thoughts about plaintiffs. Overcome the preloads that they bring with them to the courthouse. We have to do that. And then you show the circumstances, examine the circumstances of the plaintiff. How much of this did the plaintiff contribute to? And you have to be willing to accept it. You have to be willing to say, examine closely, ladies and gentlemen, the conduct of Mrs. Jones. We invite you to. May as well invite them. They're going to anyway. Examine it very closely. And then compare the conduct of Mrs. Jones in creating the circumstances that brought about this tragedy. Compare it to this animal and what he did. Maybe not. But comparing it to the defendant and what was his conduct that contributed to the circumstances. So it's all about personality versus circumstances. So Now we get to the different types of attribution, and this is, both of these attributions are so very much in our favor. We just have to take advantage of them, and you can't take advantage of them if you don't know about them. So that's why I'm here. Purposive attribution. The social psychology tells us without any doubt that the jury will more likely find negligence or whatever you're asking them to find, gross or whatever, if you show that the conduct of the defendant was done on purpose. That is on purpose. That is not intentional. We're not talking about gross negligence here. We're not talking about a wanton, willful disregard for the rights of others. We're talking about he acted on purpose. What does on purpose mean? He chose. He chose to drive this way. So you need to stress, it's called control conditions. This is control conditions. Who created those conditions that caused the tragedy? And in doing so, stress over and over from in as many different ways as you can, the choices made by the defendant, and every choice is a purpose, is made with a purpose. So by showing more choices, you're showing purposive conduct, and you're showing the safe, on the other side of that coin, you're showing the safe purposive conduct on the part of the plaintiff. So purposive attribution, extremely important. And the more purposive attribution you can get, more choices, more bad choices that were made by the defendant, which led to the tragedy, then this exacerbates damages. This is how you kick up your damages, because if you start showing enough of these bad choices, and you don't have to get to punitives, but you can. There's an irritation factor that kicks in there that increases the damages, and this is what focus groups tell us. Defendant's bad choices, and this is what you always want to stress, go into detail about what exactly the defendant did that created the circumstances. So we got to put the circumstances all over the defendant. He created them purposively, and his creation of them is what caused the whole tragedy. And it was his personality traits. Now here's the other attribution bias, which is again in our favor. Reactive attribution says that the jury may even excuse negligent conduct. May is the operative word there, but they will be much more tolerant of negligent or less than perfect conduct if the actor is acting in a reactive situation, if they're reacting to something that was imposed on them. So why is that good for us? Because in virtually every case, we are the reactors. The plaintiff is reacting to a bad situation created by the defendant. The defendant creates the bad circumstance. They try to run the red light. They do whatever. They create the bad circumstance. The plaintiff is reacting. So you want to stress this. You have to point this out to the jury. Compare their choices that created the situation to my lady who was simply reacting. She did the best she could when she was thrown into this dangerous situation by the conduct of the defendant. Reactive attribution will get you forgiveness, okay? And this takes away, does two things. It takes away from the possibility of comparative fault, and it also places all the fault back on the defendant. So that's reactive attribution. Plaintiff is simply reacting to the bad choices of the defendant. Egocentric attribution, people always seem to, they would analyze things in such a way that they attribute more good to themselves than other people would attribute to them looking at it from an external viewpoint. And that comes into play on this. It comes into play on the next attribution, which is defensive attribution. Defensive attribution is a trap. It's a trap for you and me in representing the plaintiffs. And the reason it's a trap is because it's counterintuitive. When we're looking at jury selection, we're looking at a panel. And it's very easy to look at this. And I'll tell you very briefly about an actual case where I had this thrown right at me. I represent a woman who was home with her kids on a holiday. And all the kids in the neighborhood were playing outside on this holiday. And there had been a very bad rainstorm. And what had always been their playground for decades had suddenly become a construction site where they were building part of the interstate highway system in Beaumont. And when the contractor left for the weekend, when they left for the holiday, they left all these 30-foot deep holes where they were sinking post. They left all these holes out there, unguarded, no fence around them, nothing. And when they did, the big rainstorm came, and all those 30-foot holes became 30-foot deep traps for kids. Kids all over the neighborhood are playing there. One child, her son, 11-year-old son, was out there with a 5-year-old kid and all the kids around, and the 5-year-old kid falls in the water. The 11-year-old dives in to try to find him, can't find him. The 5-year-old drowns. The 11-year-old stays on. He gets trapped. He keeps trying to save his brother, and he ends up brain damaged. So you have a brain damaged child and a dead child. Now, I did a focus group on this. And what I found, now, here, before you get to that, though, so you see a lady here who is 30 years old, and on your panel. She's 30 years old, and she's got 2 children. And your normal thought might be, you know, this lady would identify. She's going to be a good juror for me because she would identify with the loss. She could identify with how horrible it would be to lose 2 children, or to have one brain injured and the other one dead. So she's going to be on my side going in because she'll identify with my client. That's wrong, and that's why it's counterintuitive, and that's why it's a major trap. Because the fact of the matter is she's probably the worst juror you can have on your case because of defensive attribution. Because what happens is this. I did a focus group on this, and my lady the family was Vietnamese. So I did a focus group on this, and I got this response that all they wanted to talk about. I had 18 people on the focus group, and there were some men, some women. It was a mixed group. And I noticed that the women kept talking about the mother, the conduct of the mother. The men kept talking about the contractors and what they had done wrong. And so I did another focus group. And in this focus group, I brought in 24 people. I brought in 12 men and 12 women. And I presented all the same presentation to both of them, and then I divided them up into 2 separate rooms. And the women went in one room for deliberation, and the men went in the other room for deliberation. And what I found, I mean, there was no question about it. The women literally never once mentioned negligence of the construction company, even though that's what the case was about. They talked about nothing but the conduct of the mother. That's all they would discuss. The men, on the other hand, not once, not one single sentence about the conduct of the mother. The men actually came up with some very good things because some of them work construction. They came up with some very good ideas about things that the construction company had done wrong. So, and what was the answer to all of that was defensive attribution. Because defensive attribution means that the women were looking at her and they were saying, you know, she must have done something wrong. She had to do something wrong that caused this. Because if she didn't do something wrong, if she's totally innocent, what? That means it could happen to me. That means it could happen to me. So to defend themselves against even the thought that this could happen to them, they will attribute fault to her. So that's defensive attribution, and it's a trap. So be very cautious of it when you're doing void examination and when you're exercising your stracks.